Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. The Fallout lore, Iceberg explained from surface to the deepest lore. Welcome, wanderer, to the descent. Tonight, we do not begin at the bottom. We begin where everyone begins, at the surface, with the things that anyone who has spent time in the wasteland already knows. And we move downward from there through layers of increasing depth and increasing complexity until we reach the place where the lore stops being information about a fictional universe and starts being something that requires a different kind of attention entirely. The Iceberg is not a collection of secrets. It is a map of how meaning accumulates. Settle in. Let the fire burn low. Let the Geiger counter tick its patient rhythm. Let us begin the descent. The bombs fell on a Tuesday. This is the first thing, the thing that sits at the very top of the iceberg, visible to anyone who has ever loaded a Fallout game for the first time and listened to the opening narration. Legible in the aesthetic of every piece of promotional material the franchise has ever produced. October 23rd, 2077, 2 hours. The end of the world as a specific and datable event, rather than the gradual dissolution that most civilizational collapses have historically involved. The Fallout universe did not let its civilization age into irrelevance or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions across generations of progressive failure. It ended it with a specific act on a specific day, with a simultaneity that the lore consistently emphasizes, not one side striking and the other retaliating across a timeline that preserved the possibility of decision and de-escalation, but both sides striking at once, or close enough to once that the distinction was meaningless by the time the bombs stopped falling. This detail, the simultaneity, is not incidental. It is among the first and most important things the franchise communicates about what it understands the Great War to have been, which is not a war that one side started and the other was forced to finish, but a catastrophe that the logic of the situation produced, regardless of which specific institutional actor pressed which specific button first. The wasteland that results from this event is the second thing at the top of the iceberg, the specific aesthetic of the post-apocalyptic world that the franchise has constructed across its history, recognizable to anyone who has ever seen a screenshot or a box cover or a piece of fan art. The ruins of the cities, the specific quality of light through a sky that has never fully recovered the clarity it had before the bombs altered what was above it. The Nuka-Cola signs, still glowing in the darkness of structures whose other systems ceased to function 2 centuries ago. The aesthetic has a specific character that distinguishes it from other post-apocalyptic visions. The specific combination of mid-century American optimism and nuclear anxiety, of chrome and radiation, of cheerful advertising copy and catastrophic ruin. The drive-in movie screens still standing in fields where nothing grows. The vintage automobiles, nuclear-powered and stylistically frozen in the decade before the bombs, rusting in positions that mark the specific moments when their operators realized the traffic was not going to move because the city ahead was no longer a city. The robots continuing to perform their pre-war functions in environments that no longer contain the civilization. Those functions were designed to serve the Protectron, still announcing that it is here to help in a building whose the last human occupant died before anyone currently living in the wasteland was born. This aesthetic is not decoration, it is argument, the specific choice to freeze the pre-war world's cultural and aesthetic development in the 1950s, while allowing its technological development to continue well past that point to produce a society with fusion reactors and pre-war gender dynamics, with advanced robotics and segregated lunch counters, with enough nuclear capability to end human civilization and enough cultural complacency to not notice the trajectory until the bombs were already falling, is a choice whose implications run through every level of the iceberg beneath. The franchise is not nostalgic for the pre-war world. It is examining it. The specific quality of the examination is the specific quality of looking at something that understood itself as the peak of human achievement and finding, visible in every surface detail, the evidence of the specific forms of blindness that made the peak a launching pad for the catastrophe, rather than a stable condition from which the civilization could continue to develop. The Nuka-Cola sign still glowing in the dark is beautiful in a specific way that requires knowing what it was for to understand why the beauty is also terrible. The vaults are the third thing at the surface, the most widely recognized element of the franchise's specific contribution to the post-apocalyptic genre, the element whose surface-level understanding is sufficient to communicate the franchise's central betrayal. The vaults were presented to the pre-war public as survival shelters, as the government's good faith provision for its civilian population in the event of the nuclear exchange that the resource wars had been making, increasingly likely across the preceding decades. They were not survival shelters, they were experiment chambers. The people who entered them on October 23, 2077, carrying their single bags of carefully chosen possessions, saying goodbye to the world they had known, trusting in the specific way that people trust institutions whose stated purpose is their welfare. Those people were not entering protection, they were entering research protocols. The trust they extended was the specific mechanism through which the experimental access to their biology and their psychology and their social organization was secured. The vault doors closed and the experiment began. This is the surface-level understanding of the Vault program, and it is already horrifying, already sufficient to establish the franchise's foundational moral position, which is the position that the most catastrophic betrayals are not the betrayals performed by obviously malicious actors, but the betrayals performed by institutional frameworks that have been specifically designed to make their malicious character invisible to the people operating within them and to the people subject to their operations. The researcher who designed the Vault 11 sacrifice protocol understood themselves as a researcher. The government official who authorized the Vault program understood themselves as a public servant. The overseer who administered the experimental mandate understood themselves as a community leader. None of these self-understandings were entirely false. None of them were adequate to the moral reality of what was being done to the specific human beings inside the vaults. The surface layer of the iceberg establishes this gap, the gap between institutional self-presentation and institutional reality as the franchise's central subject. Everything below the surface is an elaboration of that gap in different institutional contexts and at different levels of specificity. The factions of the wasteland sit at the surface in their most familiar forms, the Brotherhood of Steel in their power armor, collecting technology, and regarding the wasteland's ordinary inhabitants with the specific combination of protectiveness and condescension that the franchise's various regional Brotherhood chapters express in different proportions. The Raiders, in their improvised fortifications, organized around the specific economics of predation that the wasteland's conditions make available to people who have concluded that taking is more reliable than producing. The super mutants, whose surface-level horror is the horror of human beings, transformed into something that the transformation has made dangerous to the humans they once were, and that carries within its specific biology the evidence of the specific institutional decision to expose the population of Vault 87 to the forced evolutionary virus within hours of the vault doors closing. The ghouls, whose specific combination of human continuity and transformed biology the franchise consistently uses to examine questions about identity and memory and what it costs a consciousness to outlive the world it was formed in. Each of these populations is, at the surface level, a specific type of post-war inhabitant with specific capabilities and specific relationships to the other inhabitants of the wasteland at every layer below the surface. Each of them is something more complicated, a specific expression of the specific processes that the Great War and its aftermath set in motion in the biology and the social organization and the moral frameworks of the people who survived it. The Nuka-Cola Corporation sits at the surface as the franchise's most recognizable commercial institution, the source of the bottles that constitute the wasteland's most widely distributed artifact, the brand whose aesthetic saturates the pre-war world's visual environment and therefore the post-war world's ruins. What most people know about Nuka-Cola at the surface level is that it was ubiquitous, that it was sweet, that the quantum variant was radioactive and blue and worth more than the standard variety, and that the corporation's branding has proven more durable than the civilization that produced it. What the surface level already communicates to anyone paying attention to what the ubiquity of the brand implies about the pre-war world is that the corporation had achieved the specific kind of cultural saturation that converts a commercial relationship into something more like an identity commitment, that the people who drank Nuka-Cola were not simply making a purchasing decision, but participating in a cultural practice whose emotional resonance extended far beyond the beverage itself. The wasteland's relationship to Nuka-Cola artifacts, the specific quality of value attached to an intact bottle, the specific warmth that Fallout New Vegas's NPCs express when discussing the taste of a pre-war sunset sarsaparilla, is the relationship of people maintaining a connection to a world they lost through the specific physical objects that world left behind. The surface layer shows this. The deeper layers show what the corporation was doing behind the brand. The surface is not thin. This is the observation that the descent requires establishing before it can precede the recognition that the elements most people know about the Fallout franchise are already complex, already philosophically loaded, already encoding the franchise's deepest concerns in their most accessible form. The Great War's simultaneity already says something about institutional logic and its relationship to individual decision-making. The Vault program's betrayal already says something about the gap between institutional self-presentation and institutional reality. The Wasteland's aesthetic already says something about the relationship between cultural optimism and civilizational blindness. The faction's surface characterizations already contain within them the ideological conflicts and the institutional pathologies that the deeper layers will examine in greater detail. The surface is not the simple layer that the iceberg metaphor might suggest, the layer where the obvious things are kept while the interesting things are hidden underneath. It is the compressed layer where the interesting things are present in their most accessible form, waiting for the attention that the descent provides to make their complexity visible. Everything below is an expansion of what the surface already contains. The descent does not move from simple to complex. It moves from compressed to elaborated, from gestured at to fully examined, from the image that makes the franchise recognizable to the argument that makes the franchise significant. The pre-war world of the Fallout universe is not the real world of the 1950s and 60s. That its aesthetic references is not the actual historical period whose cultural artifacts it borrows so comprehensively that the borrowing can feel, to someone who has not examined it carefully, like straightforward nostalgia. It is something more specific and more deliberately constructed than nostalgia, a counterfactual civilization designed to make visible, through the specific distortions of its counterfactual character, the specific features of the actual historical period that the actual historical period's own ideology had been specifically organized to make invisible. The pre-war world of Fallout is the world that the 1950s most optimistic self-presentation implied was possible. A world in which the specific combination of American technological ingenuity, American institutional confidence, and American consumer capitalism had produced the specific future that the World's Fair exhibits and the popular mechanics covers and the suburban development brochures had promised. It is also, simultaneously and without contradiction, the world in which that specific combination had produced its logical terminal point, the specific catastrophe that the same institutional logic pursued consistently enough and long enough in the specific conditions that the resource wars created was always going to produce. The pre-war world is not a portrait of historical innocence corrupted by circumstance. It is a portrait of historical inevitability, of a civilization that understood itself as moving toward a particular kind of future, and that was, without fully understanding it, moving toward a different kind of future instead. The specific mechanism of this movement was the resource wars. Not simply a conflict over oil, but the specific process through which the depletion of a resource that industrial civilization had organized itself entirely around converted the ordinary competition of nations into the specific kind of existential competition that military force addresses when the economic and diplomatic instruments have been exhausted. The European Commonwealth's invasion of the Middle East in 2052 was not the beginning of the resource wars in any meaningful causal sense. It was the first instance in which the competition that had been occurring through economic and diplomatic channels crossed the threshold into overt military conflict, which is a different kind of beginning from the causal one. The causal beginning was the specific rate of petroleum depletion relative to the specific rate of industrial civilization's petroleum consumption, a relationship that had been producing its specific consequences for decades before any army crossed any border. The armies were the symptom, the depletion was the disease, and the specific character of the disease, the way it converted every dimension of international competition into a zero-sum calculation whose stakes were the continued functioning of the competing civilizations' industrial economy, meant that the symptom was always going to get worse as the disease progressed, regardless of the specific diplomatic or military outcomes of any specific conflict. The United States of the Fallout universe had developed, across the decades between the actual 1950s and the 2077 of the Great War, into a specific and peculiar kind of political entity, one whose technological sophistication had continued to advance, while its cultural and institutional development had effectively stalled at the specific configuration that the projectively post-war prosperity of the mid-20th century had produced. The specific causes of this developmental stasis are not comprehensively documented in the franchise's lore, but its specific character is visible in every detail of the pre-war world's aesthetic. A society that had developed fusion reactors while retaining the social hierarchies of the Eisenhower era, that had produced sophisticated artificial intelligence and maintained the gender roles of the 1950s, that had created the technological capability to end human civilization and maintained the specific combination of institutional confidence and cultural complacency that made the use of that capability feel, to the people responsible for it, like a regrettable last resort rather than the catastrophe that its consequences demonstrate it was. The stasis was not the product of any specific decision or any specific institutional failure. It was the aggregate of the specific institutional incentives and cultural dynamics of a society that had found a configuration it was comfortable with and had organized its considerable resources toward maintaining that configuration, rather than toward the kinds of developmental disruption that genuine cultural and institutional progress requires. The corporations that dominated the pre-war American economy were the most powerful institutional expression of this configuration, the specific actors whose resources and whose political influence most directly shaped the conditions that the Great War's final years produced. Vault-Tec Corporation, whose relationship to the Vault program constitutes the franchise's most comprehensively documented corporate atrocity, was not an aberration within the pre-war corporate landscape. It was its most complete expression, a corporation that had achieved sufficient institutional influence to convert what should have been a public welfare program into a private research enterprise, that had developed sufficient political relationships to ensure that the regulatory oversight which should have prevented this conversion was never applied, and that had developed sufficient institutional sophistication to ensure that the people within the corporation who administered the program understood themselves as researchers and administrators rather than as the perpetrators of systematic abuse on a national scale. The specific mechanisms through which Vault-Tec managed this institutional self-understanding are documented in the franchise's terminal records and holotapes with a specificity that makes the mechanics of corporate moral insulation available for examination. The classification systems that restricted knowledge of experimental protocols to levels of the organization sufficiently removed from the human consequences of those protocols to perform the cost-benefit calculations. Their jobs required, without the interference of direct knowledge of what those calculations were costing the specific people they were being performed about. West-Tec Research Facility and its forced evolutionary virus program represents a different dimension of the pre-war corporate landscape's character, the specific dimension of military contracted research, whose institutional framework removes the ethical evaluation of what the research is for from the domain of the researchers performing it, assigning it instead to the military clients whose strategic requirements the research serves. The West-Tec researchers who developed the FEV were not people who had decided to create a biological weapon capable of fundamentally rewriting the genetic code of whatever organism was exposed to it. They were researchers who had been contracted to solve a specific technical problem, the development of a biological agent capable of producing enhanced soldiers, and who were applying the professional frameworks of their discipline to the specific technical challenge that contract defined. The ethical question of what the enhanced soldiers would be used for and what the process of enhancement would do to the specific human beings subjected to it had been assigned to the military clients and the government officials who had commissioned the research. The researchers understood their responsibility as ending at the boundary of the specific technical deliverable of the contract required. The boundary was institutional, the harm was not. Robco Industries and its contributions to the pre-war world's technological landscape represent the specific dimension of the corporate character that is most visible in the wasteland's daily environment. The robots and the Pip-Boys and the terminals that constitute the material infrastructure through which the pre-war world's technological achievements are most directly experienced by wasteland inhabitants 2 centuries after the corporation that produced them ceased to function. What the omnipresence of Robco products in the post-war landscape communicates about the pre-war corporate landscape is the specific fact of a corporation that had achieved sufficient penetration of the pre-war world's daily life that its products outlasted the civilization that had produced them by the better part of 2 centuries, while continuing to perform the functions they had been designed to perform. The Protectron, still directing traffic in an intersection where the last car rusted away a century ago, is not simply a comedic image, though it is also that. It is a specific commentary on what it means for institutional products to outlast the institutional framework that gave them their purpose for the infrastructure of a civilization to continue operating according to its programming, in the absence of the civilization that the programming was designed to serve. Poseidon Energy and the specific role it played in the pre-war world's petroleum economy represents the dimension of the corporate landscape most directly connected to the resource war's specific mechanism. Corporation that controlled significant portions of the pre-war United States' domestic petroleum production, and whose decisions about extraction rates and pricing and the management of its political relationships with the government constituted one of the primary variables in the specific arithmetic of resource scarcity that the resource wars were the military expression of. The specific character of Poseidon Energy's institutional history, its relationship to the government, its management of the specific tensions between its commercial interests and the national resource interests that the government was supposed to represent, its conduct in the specific period when the resource situation was becoming acute enough that the distinctions between commercial interest and national interest were becoming impossible to maintain, is documented in the Mast franchise's records with sufficient specificity to constitute a case study in the specific mechanisms through which large commercial actors and the governments that nominally regulate them develop the specific relationship of mutual accommodation that produces institutional outcomes that neither party's stated values would have endorsed if they had been required to describe them accurately in advance. The Sino-American War and its Alaskan theater constitute the most directly documented military dimension of the pre-war world's specific character, the specific conflict in which the resource competition that had been converting diplomatic relationships into military relationships across the preceding 2 decades reached the point of direct conventional military engagement between the two major powers whose relative standing in the post-resource wars world would determine whose civilization would have sufficient access to the remaining petroleum supply to continue functioning. The specific character of the Alaskan front, the cold, the terrain, the specific quality of a conventional military engagement between two technologically sophisticated forces in an environment that neither had been optimized for is documented in the franchise's lore with a granularity that makes the human cost of the specific conflict visible in a way that the resource war's broader sweep does not permit. The T-45 power armor deployed at Anchorage, the specific propaganda apparatus that managed the American civilian population's understanding of the war's character and progress, the Anchorage reclamation that the pre-war government celebrated as the military achievement whose momentum was disrupted 9 months later by the bombs. All of these constitute the specific texture of a civilization managing its terminal crisis through the instruments that its specific institutional framework had made available, which were military and technological instruments deployed in service of resource acquisition rather than the diplomatic and structural instruments that the crisis's actual character required. What the pre-war world's specific character reveals about the franchise's diagnostic is the observation that the Great War was not the product of any single bad decision or any single malicious actor or any single institutional failure. It was the product of the specific aggregate of all the decisions and all the actors and all the institutional frameworks that the pre-war world had produced the product, in other words, of the civilization itself, operating according to its own specific logic in the specific conditions that the resource wars had created. This is the franchise's most important and most uncomfortable claim. The claim that the catastrophe was not aberrant but comprehensible, not the deviation from the civilization's values but their logical extension, not the failure of the civilization's institutions, but their success in pursuing the objectives those institutions had been designed to pursue. The pre-war world did not fail to be what it said it was. It was exactly what it said it was, and what it said it was a technologically sophisticated, commercially dynamic, institutionally confident civilization organized around the accumulation of national power and the maintenance of economic growth in conditions of increasing resource scarcity, produced the Great War as its specific terminal achievement. The Vault experiments, examined in their full documentary reality rather than in the surface-level understanding that the Vaults were simply experiments, constitute the most comprehensive, available record of what the pre-war institutional framework was willing to do to human beings when the institutional framework provided sufficient cover and the human beings had no recourse. The full range of documented experimental protocols across the franchise's canonical vaults is a range that moves from the relatively benign social isolation studies, generational transmission experiments, the testing of how communities maintain cultural coherence in the absence of external input, to the comprehensively atrocious, with the majority of documented cases clustering toward the atrocious end in ways that reflect the specific research agenda that Vault-Tec and its government partners had determined were the most valuable uses of the captive population the Vault program had provided them. The range's existence is itself informative. The fact that some Vaults conducted relatively benign experiments, while others conducted the systematic abuse of their entire populations, establishes that the atrocity was not simply the product of the experimental design process, running out of benign questions to ask, but of a research agenda that had included atrocious questions from the beginning and had assigned the atrocious protocols to specific facilities, while assigning the less harmful ones to others, according to criteria that the surviving documentation does not fully specify, but that the distribution of outcomes makes clear, were not organized around minimizing harm to the subjects. Vault 11's sacrifice lottery is the experiment that the franchise documents most completely, and whose full accounting is the most precise illustration available of what the Vault program's research agenda was actually studying at its most extreme. The inhabitants who sealed themselves inside Vault 11 were told, once the doors closed, that the Vault's computer system required a human sacrifice annually, that if one inhabitant was not delivered to the overseer's chamber each year, the automated systems would kill all of them. The claim was false. The threat had no operational reality. The automated systems had no capacity to harm the inhabitants. What the experiment was studying was whether a confined population, confronted with a demand for annual human sacrifice, would comply, whether the mechanism of democratic selection or some other social process would emerge for determining whose life would be taken, whether the compliance would be maintained across multiple iterations of the demand, and whether and under what conditions resistance would finally develop. The 5 people who were killed in Vault 11 across the years before a group of inhabitants finally refused to comply were killed for a false premise, by people who had developed through the specific social and institutional dynamics of life inside an experimental vault, the specific capacity to participate in the routine killing of their neighbors that the experimental design required. The researchers got their answer. The 5 dead people were the price of the answer. The answer has not been recorded in any surviving document as having produced any outcome for the researchers that would justify that price, because the justification was not the point. The data was the point. The human cost of the data was a variable that the experimental framework had determined was acceptable. Vault 87 in the capital wasteland represents the experimental protocol at its most immediately lethal. The vault that was designated from its original design as a testing site for the forced evolutionary virus, whose inhabitants were exposed to FEV almost immediately after the doors closed, and who constitute the founding population of the super mutants that terrorized the capital wasteland for the 2 centuries between the Great War and the events of Fallout 3. The inhabitants of Vault 87 who walked through those doors on October 23, 2077. The engineers and the teachers and the families with children, the people who had made the specific calculations about what to bring in a single bag for the end of the world, were transformed within hours of their arrival into the population of beings whose relationship to what they had been before the transformation was the relationship of biological continuity without psychological or social continuity. The specific relationship that the FEV conversion produces in people whose transformation has been sufficiently complete that the original person is not recoverable from what the transformation has left. They had carried their bags with them through those doors. They had been saying goodbye. Vault 92 in the capital wasteland was designed for a population of musicians and creative artists, a design choice that the official Vault-Tec documentation had presented as a commendably enlightened approach to cultural preservation, and that actually served the experiment's requirements by providing a population of people with a shared professional identity and a shared practice that would be visible in their behavior and that would allow researchers to observe how the experiment's specific intervention affected a community organized around creative production. The intervention was the introduction of subliminal audio signals into the Vault's white noise system sounds at frequencies calibrated to interact with human neurological processes in ways that would trigger episodes of acute psychosis in susceptible individuals at unpredictable intervals, with no apparent cause that the Vault's population could identify. The research question was how a community would respond to unpredictable outbreaks of violence among its own members when those outbreaks had no identifiable cause, whether it would develop explanatory frameworks for what was happening, whether it would identify the guilty parties accurately or inaccurately, whether it would fracture or cohere, and what the specific social dynamics of a community managing a threat it could not identify would look like in a closed environment over an extended period. The Vault's terminal records document the experiment's progress through the specific deterioration of the community's social fabric, the suspicion, the fragmentation of trust, the progressive erosion of the collaborative relationships that music requires, and that the Vault's original design had been calibrated to produce. The experiment continued until the community had effectively destroyed itself. The musicians who had entered Vault 92 as people with a shared vocation and a shared practice ended as the specific product of an experiment that had used their specific community dynamics as the mechanism through which the research question could be answered. Vault 75, located in the Boston area and documented in Fallout 4, was designed around a population of children, specifically around the systematic selection and training of children with exceptional physical and cognitive potential through a program that the children themselves were told was a standard educational curriculum, and that was actually the development of child soldiers whose capabilities the Vault's military contracted research agenda had been designed to optimize. The children who entered Vault 75 went through a process of selection and training that the surviving records document in the specific language of military assessment and enhancement protocol, the combat training, the physical conditioning, the cognitive testing, the specific identification of the children whose profiles matched the research program's target parameters, and the specific fate of the children whose profiles did not match. The Vault's adult population was not the community the children had been told it was. It was the staff of a research facility present to administer the program, not to provide the community of care that the word adult implies for children in the ordinary sense. What Vault 75's experimental design reveals about the Vault program's research agenda at its most specific is the specific quality of the answer to the question of what the program was studying, not social dynamics in the abstract, not the effects of isolation on community formation in general, but the specific question of what specifically designed conditions could produce in terms of human performance optimization. A question that the military dimensions of the government's research interests had identified as the most valuable available use of the captive population the Vault program had provided. The overseer system, whose operation administered the experimental protocols across the Vault network, constitutes the most directly personal dimension of the program's human cost, not the cost to the Vault inhabitants, which was the cost most people think of first, but the cost to the specific individuals who were selected as overseers and who were therefore placed in the specific position of administering programs whose character they understood more fully than the populations they administered. Some overseers were selected because their psychological profiles indicated they would comply with experimental mandates without resistance that would compromise the research program's integrity. Some were selected despite profiles that suggested they might resist, because the research program's questions included questions about overseer behavior and the specific conditions under which institutional authority figures would maintain or abandon their mandates. Some overseers resisted and were replaced. Some overseers complied and carried the compliance across the years of their administration in the specific form that complicity with systematic harm carries when the person complicit in it retains the moral awareness that would make the mark complicity costless if they lacked it. The terminal entries that survive from overseers who understood what they were doing and did it anyway are among the franchise's most specifically affecting documents, not because they describe dramatic suffering, but because they describe the specific quality of a person who has concluded that the institutional obligation is sufficient reason to continue performing actions that their genuine moral assessment has established are wrong, and who records that conclusion in the private documentation of an administrative function that no one was expected to read for 200 years. What the full accounting of the Vault experiments reveals about the institutional framework that produced them is the specific observation that the framework was not exceptional and was not a unique aberration within the pre-war institutional landscape, but a specific application of the same institutional logic that the Nuka-Cola Corporation applied to its radiological research, and that West Tech applied to its weapons development, and that the government applied to its military contracting across the full range of the pre-war world's institutional activity. The logic was the logic of professional function within institutional frameworks organized around defined objectives, the logic that assigns the ethical evaluation of what the function is for to roles sufficiently distant from the function's execution that the evaluation never encounters the reality of what the function is producing, that fragments the question of what is being done to human beings into components small enough that no individual component requires anyone to answer it directly, and that converts the specific harm done to specific people into the abstract categories that institutional documentation requires for its accounting. The Vault program was this logic at its most comprehensively, realized the most complete available expression of what a sufficiently sophisticated institutional framework can produce when it is organized around the pursuit of defined research objectives, without any external accountability structure capable of constraining what the pursuit of those objectives is permitted to cost the people bearing the cost. The New California Republic, at its surface, presents itself as the most recognizable of the Fallout universe's post-war political formations, the faction whose stated values most directly echo the values of the pre-war, the democratic republic that the Great War destroyed, whose organizational structure most closely replicates the institutional forms that democratic governance employs, and whose explicit project most straightforwardly addresses the question of what rebuilding civilization after catastrophic collapse requires: a Senate with elected representatives, a professional military with a command hierarchy, a legal system with courts and enforcement mechanisms, a currency whose value is backed by water rather than gold, but that performs the same social function of enabling exchange across communities that share its acceptance as a medium of value. At the surface level, the NCR is the faction that represents the project of reconstruction, the attempt to recover from the catastrophe, not simply the material conditions of pre-war life, but the specific institutional forms through which the pre-war world had organized its collective life around values and procedures that extended beyond the immediate interests of whoever happened to hold power at any given moment. The fourth layer of the iceberg requires examining what the NCR's actual history reveals about whether this project is succeeding, and the examination produces a portrait considerably more complicated than the surface level account of a democracy rebuilding from catastrophe. The specific failures that the NCR's history documents are not the failures of corruption in the simple sense of bad actors exploiting a sound system. They are the failures of institutional dynamics in the specific sense of processes that the system's own design reliably generates when the system operates at sufficient scale and over sufficient time, processes that the failure pre-war republic had also generated, and that the franchise consistently presents as evidence, not of the NCR's failure to be what it aspires to be, but of the specific challenge that democratic institutions face when the scale of their operations brings them into contact with the specific economic and military pressures that the resource wars and their aftermath produced in the pre-war world, and that the NCR's own expansion is producing in the post-war one. The Brahmin barons, whose economic interests have captured the NCR Senate's decision-making, represent not corruption, but a specific institutional dynamic, the dynamic through which concentrated economic interests convert. democratic processes into instruments of their own reproduction. The dynamic that the franchise consistently presents as the natural product of market economies, operating within democratic frameworks without the specific oversight mechanisms that genuine accountability requires. The NCR's military overextension at the Mojave Front represents not strategic incompetence, but the specific institutional dynamic of a military whose scale of commitment has outpaced the political economy's capacity to sustain it. The dynamic that produces the specific combination of genuine dedication among the soldiers bearing the operational cost and genuine inadequacy in the institutional response to what those soldiers' dedication is actually accomplishing. Caesar's Legion, at its surface, is the Fallout New Vegas faction, whose surface presentation most directly invites the conclusion that no further examination is required. A slave-holding military autocracy that crucifies its enemies and burns the communities it conquers, whose aesthetic of Roman referencing martial discipline and whose explicit embrace of brutality as an organizing principle seem to place it outside the range of genuine ideological consideration. The fourth layer requires the specific effort of engaging with Edward Sallow's actual intellectual argument, rather than simply with the institutional practices its implementation produced, because the franchise has constructed Caesar as a character with a specific intellectual history and a specific philosophical framework that it presents as deserving genuine engagement rather than simple dismissal. Sallow was a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse before he became Caesar, a scholar of pre-war history whose engagement with the texts that survived the Great War included a specific engagement with the philosophers of history that the franchise explicitly names as his intellectual influences. His argument, reconstructed from the dialogue options in Fallout New Vegas, is a specific argument about the relationship between social organization and civilizational survival. The argument that the pre-war world's failure was the failure of a specific kind of social complexity, that the institutions and the ideological frameworks and the competing interests that complex democratic societies generate are the specific mechanisms through which civilizations become unable to coordinate the collective action that existential threats require, and that the specific antidote to this failure is the specific simplicity of a social organization organized entirely around military hierarchy and collective discipline. The argument is internally coherent within its own premises. It is also wrong in ways that the franchise documents through the specific evidence of what the Legion's implementation of the argument has produced the populations the Legion has enslaved, the communities it has destroyed, and the specific quality of the social organization it has produced among its own members, which is not the genuinely simplified collective action the argument promised, but the specific social dynamics of a coercive institution whose members' compliance is purchased through the combination of genuine indoctrination, genuine terror. The Brotherhood of Steel requires the fourth layer's examination precisely because the surface understanding of the faction, the power-armored technology hoarders, whose relationship to the wasteland's ordinary inhabitants ranges from protective paternalism to complete indifference, depending on the regional chapter, does not adequately account for the specific institutional history and the specific foundational trauma that produced the Brotherhood's characteristic behaviors and attitudes. Roger Maxon's founding mutiny at Mariposa military base in the months before the Great War was the specific event that established the Brotherhood's institutional character. A military officer who had discovered that his unit had been conducting FEV experiments on civilian subjects, who had concluded that the chain of command that ordered those experiments had forfeited its claim on his soldiers' loyalty, and who had established, in the specific conditions of that moral crisis, the specific institutional response that the Brotherhood has been reproducing across the 2 centuries since. The response was not simply rebellion against a corrupt order. It was the construction of an alternative institutional identity, organized around the specific combination of military discipline and technological custodianship that Maxon understood as the antidote to the specific institutional failure. He had witnessed the failure of an institution that had accumulated sufficient technological power to conduct the atrocities the Mariposa program had conducted, and that had produced insufficient ethical constraint on the exercise of that power to prevent it. The Brotherhood's hoarding of technology is not simply acquisitiveness. It is the specific institutional expression of the founding trauma's lesson, the lesson that advanced technology in the hands of institutions without adequate ethical constraint produces the specific outcomes that the FEV program produced, and that the appropriate response to this lesson is the restriction of advanced technology to an institution whose members have been trained through the Brotherhood's specific institutional culture to exercise the ethical constraint that the pre-war institutions had failed to maintain. The Institute, in its full fourth-layer complexity, requires the specific recognition that its institutional failure is not the failure of malice, but the failure of the specific form of institutional isolation that the franchise consistently presents as among the most dangerous available conditions for scientific research, the condition in which an institution develops over sufficient time and in sufficient remove from the external world, a self-referential culture whose ethical frameworks are generated entirely from within the institution's own history and whose external accountability has been reduced to zero. The Institute's scientists are not villains in any simple sense. They are researchers whose professional commitments are genuine and whose technical achievements are real, and whose understanding of what those achievements are for has been shaped entirely by the specific institutional culture that 2 centuries of underground isolation have produced. The specific horror of the Institute is the horror of genuine intelligence and genuine competence deployed in the service of objectives that the institution's own internal culture has determined are legitimate, and that the present wastelands external perspective consistently and specifically contradicts the horror of people who are very good at what they do and who have no reliable mechanism for evaluating whether what they do is worth being very good at. What the full fourth-layer examination of the factions reveals about the franchise's ideological architecture is the specific recognition that the franchise does not construct its factions as simple moral alternatives whose comparison produces an obvious correct answer. It constructs them as genuine expressions of different responses to the specific question that the Great War poses about what went wrong and what rebuilding should look like, responses that are each internally coherent within their own premises, each capable of producing genuine goods for the specific people, their implementation's benefit, and each carrying within their specific institutional logic the specific failure modes that the franchise's narrative consistently documents when the factions are examined across the full span of their histories rather than at any single point in their development. The NCR's democracy can capture, the Legion's discipline can brutalize, the Brotherhood's custodianship can hoard, the Institute's science can instrumentalize. Each failure mode is the specific institutional expression of the same dynamic. The dynamic through which an institution organized around a defined purpose progressively converts everything in its operational environment, including the human beings that environment contains, into resources for the pursuit of that purpose. The franchise's factions are not illustrations of the specific ideologies they express. They are illustrations of what specific ideologies produce when they are implemented through institutional frameworks that have been specifically organized around their pursuit, which is always something more complicated and more costly to the specific people bearing the cost than the ideology's surface formulation would have predicted. Richard Gray was not, before his transformation, a person whose history suggested he would become the most philosophically ambitious antagonist that the Fallout franchise would produce. He was a scientist, a researcher whose engagement with the pre-war world's biological sciences had given him the specific combination of genuine intellectual capability and professional ambition that the pre-war research establishment rewarded, and whose specific history before the events that produced the master is documented in the franchise's lore with sufficient detail to establish him as a person rather than simply as the origin point of a catastrophe. He was not a monster before the Mariposa military base. He was a man who went to Mariposa looking for something for the FEV research that the base housed, whose existence he had become aware of through the specific channels that the pre-war scientific community's information environment made available to researchers whose work brought them into contact with military research programs, and who found, in the vats of the base, something that his subsequent account describes as a revelation, a dissolution, and a reconstruction in forms that the person who entered Mariposa could not have anticipated, and that the entity that emerged from the vats could not fully communicate in the terms that the original person's language had been developed to express. The transformation that produced the master was not a simple biological alteration of the kind that the forced evolutionary virus produced in the super mutants whose creation his subsequent program required. It was something more comprehensive and more strange a process that the entity's own descriptions, available through the dialogue options of the original Fallout game, characterize as the dissolution of the boundaries between his individual consciousness and the consciousnesses of the other biological material in the vats, the progressive absorption of other minds into a system that retained Richard Gray's intellectual architecture as its organizing structure, while adding to that structure the specific cognitive and sensory capabilities of the entities it had absorbed, the master's specific intelligence, the quality of it, the speed and the depth and the specific philosophical ambition that the franchise's characterization of him consistently demonstrates is not simply the intelligence of a talented pre-war scientist whose biological transformation has enhanced his cognitive capabilities. It is the intelligence of a mind that has incorporated other minds, that processes information through a framework expanded by the specific perspectives and capabilities of the entities it has absorbed, and that has been thinking, across the years, between the transformation and the events of the first game, about the specific question that its own existence most immediately posed the question of what the human species was for, and whether the species that had ended its own civilization was a species worth preserving in the specific form that had produced the catastrophe. The Unity's actual argument, examined at the fifth layer of the iceberg rather than at the surface level where it can be dismissed as simply the villain's rationalization for atrocity, is an argument that deserves the specific quality of engagement that the franchise's construction of the master consistently demands. The argument begins with an observation that is accurate that the post-war environment's radiation levels represent a genuine long-term biological threat to normal human populations, whose cellular repair mechanisms were not developed in conditions of chronic elevated radiation exposure and whose continued survival in such conditions depends on the specific combination of protective technology and behavioral adaptation that post-war communities have developed at considerable cost. The argument continues with a projection that is plausible that the long-term trajectory of normal human survival in the post-war environment is negative, that the radiation accumulating in the soil and the water and the food chain is producing a slow biological attrition in normal human populations, whose consequences will compound across generations in ways that the communities managing the immediate challenges of day-to-day survival in the wasteland have insufficient resources to monitor or address. The argument concludes with a prescription that is monstrous in its implementation and internally coherent in its logic, that the replacement of the radiation-vulnerable, normal human population with the radiation-immune, supermutant population is not genocide in the morally relevant sense, because the people being replaced are people who are going to die anyway, just more slowly, and that the Unity is therefore a project of transformation rather than destruction, a mercy rather than a massacre. conducted at a scale and a pace whose specific costs are justified by the specific outcome that the Unity's completion would produce, the argument is wrong. It is wrong first because the empirical premise is wrong. The post-war human population, while facing genuine biological challenges from the changed environment, has demonstrated across 2 centuries of post-war survival a capacity for adaptation that the master's model had not adequately accounted for, a capacity that is visible in the specific communities and the specific individuals who have maintained functional biological integrity across generations in conditions that the master's trajectory projections had determined were not compatible with long-term normal human survival. It is wrong second because the premises about supermutant viability are wrong specifically because the supermutants are universally sterile, a fact that the master's research program had either failed to establish or had established and had found some way to rationalize past, a fact that means the Unity's completion would have produced not a viable replacement population, but a numerically growing and reproductively incapable population whose terminal decline was built into its biology in ways that made the program's long-term premise, the provision of a viable successor to the doomed normal human population, impossible, regardless of how comprehensively the military objectives were achieved. The moment of the master's confrontation with this information, the specific dialogue exchange in the original Fallout game, in which the Vault Dweller can present the evidence of supermutant sterility and allow the master to process its implications, is among the most philosophically significant moments that the Fallout franchise has produced across its full history, because of what the master does with the information. He does not deny it. He does not construct an alternative interpretation that preserves the Unity's viability in the face of contrary evidence. He examines the logical implications of the information with the specific intellectual honesty that the franchise has established as his characteristic cognitive mode, arrives at the conclusion that the information's implications are fatal to the Unity's central premise, and accepts the conclusion in the specific way that a person accepts a conclusion, whose acceptance requires the acknowledgement that their life's work has been organized around a false foundation. The acceptance produces his decision to end the Unity and to end himself not as an act of dramatic, villainous self-destruction, but as the specific response of a person whose commitment to the internal consistency of his own argument is sufficient to follow that argument to conclusions that the argument's failure makes unavoidable. What the master's intellectual honesty in defeat reveals about the franchise's approach to its antagonists is the specific quality of respect that the franchise extends to its most philosophically ambitious villains. Recognition that the most compelling expressions of catastrophically wrong ideas are not the expressions produced by simple malice or simple stupidity, but the expressions produced by genuine intelligence, genuinely engaged with genuine problems, arriving at wrong answers through intellectual processes that are themselves rigorous and that fail not because of cognitive or moral deficiency in the person performing them, but because the premises from which those processes begin are false in ways that the available evidence had not made adequately visible before the process had been carried far enough to produce its catastrophic results. The master is not a monster who happens to be smart. He is a genuinely intelligent person who has produced a genuinely wrong answer to a genuinely important question, and whose response to the demonstration of that wrongness is the specific response of intellectual honesty rather than the specific response of institutional self-preservation that most of the franchise's other antagonists demonstrate when their premises are challenged by contrary evidence. The Unity's legacy in the post-war world, the super-mutant populations that the program produced across different regions of the wasteland, the specific communities and individuals among those populations who demonstrate the specific forms of retained humanity that the FEV conversion did not eliminate, constitutes the franchise's most sustained examination of the question of what personhood requires, and whether it persists through the kind of radical, physical transformation that the Unity program imposed on the people it converted. Harold, who was exposed to FEV at Mariposa, but underwent a different and partially incomplete transformation that left him recognizably human in his social and cognitive functioning, while progressively transforming his biology in ways that would eventually produce the specific being that the capital wastelands inhabitants knew as the living god of Oasis, is the franchise's most extreme case study in the question of what continuity of personhood across biological transformation actually looks like when the transformation is extended across decades rather than occurring in the sudden way that the standard FEV conversion produces. The master's own transformation, the absorption of other minds, the loss of the specific biological form of a normal human body, the development of capabilities and perspectives that the original Richard Gray could not have possessed, poses the same question in its most radical form. Was the master Richard Gray? Was the entity that emerged from Mariposa the same person who entered it, continuous with that person in the ways that matter for personhood? Or was the person who entered Mariposa destroyed by the transformation and replaced by something that had inherited his memories and his intellectual frameworks without being genuinely continuous with him? The franchise does not answer this question. It poses it through the master's specific characterization and through his specific response to defeat in a form that makes the question genuinely difficult rather than rhetorically convenient. The protagonists of the various Fallout games are not interchangeable avatars whose specific backstories are incidental decoration on the gameplay framework that constitutes the actual experience of the franchise. They are specific characterizations whose specific circumstances and specific relationships to the worlds they inhabit have been constructed with sufficient care that the patterns across the franchise's protagonist history constitute a genuine examination of what the franchise understands, the wasteland survivor's fundamental existential situation, to be what it means to be a person navigating a world organized around purposes and by forces that the person did not choose and cannot simply opt out of, carrying the specific weight of a history that the wasteland has not finished producing. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout is the protagonist whose specific circumstances most directly establish the franchise's foundational existential structure. A person who was sent out of the only world they had known to address a specific practical problem, whose engagement with the world outside that vault in the course of addressing the problem produced an understanding of what the vault actually was and what the wasteland actually was, that the person who had been sent to find a water chip had not possessed. The specific weight of the Vault Dweller's experience is not simply the weight of having witnessed the scale of the Great War's consequences or having discovered the Vault program's experimental character. It is the weight of having returned from that experience to the community that had sent them, having secured the water chip that the Vault needed, and having defeated the Master's Unity, and having done the specific things that the Vault's survival and the Wasteland's survival required, and having been exiled by that community in the specific form of exile that the franchise documents as the Overseer's decision to expel the Vault Dweller, rather than reintegrate them into the Vault's social structure. The specific logic of the exile, the Overseer's assessment that the Vault Dweller's exposure to the outside world had made them incompatible with the Vault's continued functional stability, that the specific knowledge and the specific capabilities and the specific quality of having experienced the world outside the Vault had made them a vector for the disruption of the managed environment that the Vault's social order required, is a logic that the franchise presents with the specific ambiguity that the franchise's most morally complex institutional decisions always carry. The Overseer is not simply wrong. The specific concern about what the Vault Dweller's reintegration would produce in the Vault's population is not an unreasonable concern. The managed environment of the vault was not designed to accommodate the specific kind of person who had experienced what the vault dweller had experienced, and who would carry that experience into every subsequent interaction with a community whose members had not experienced it. The exile was a specific institutional response to a specific, genuine challenge. It was also the abandonment of a person who had done what the community required, and who was owed something for that service, something more than the specific reward of being expelled from the only home they had ever known. The chosen one of Fallout 2 carries the specific weight of a different kind of inheritance, not the weight of exile, but the weight of legendary status imposed by a community that needs a particular kind of person to exist, and that has found, in the Vault Dweller's lineage, a candidate they can project that particular kind of person onto, regardless of whether the actual individual bearing the lineage is genuinely that person. The chosen one is the Vault Dweller's grandchild, born not in a vault but in the specific post-war community of Arroyo that the Vault Dweller had founded after the exile, living the specific life of a person who has grown up in the shadow of a legendary ancestor whose story has been simplified and mythologized in the specific ways that important stories always are when they are transmitted across generations in communities without the documentary infrastructure that would allow the complexity of the original to be preserved. The Chosen One's mission to find the Garden of Eden creation kit that the Elders of Arroyo have determined is the community's only hope for survival is a mission assigned to a specific person, not because that person has been assessed as the individual most capable of accomplishing it, but because the community needs the mission to be accomplished by a person whose lineage connects it to the founding legend, and because the available candidate is the person who happens to be the Vault Dweller's grandchild, regardless of what the grandchild's specific capabilities and specific readiness for the mission actually are. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 carries the franchise's most explicitly Oedipal narrative structure, a person whose entire life has been organized around the presence and then the absence of a father, whose mission is the search for that father, and whose discovery of what the father was doing with Project Purity and what Project Purity was for produces the specific experience of a child encountering their parent as a person with a purpose that extends beyond the parent-child relationship, and that the child is required to either join or oppose. James, the Lone Wanderer's father, is not simply a parent who has abandoned his child in the service of a cause. He is a person whose commitment to Project Purity, whose understanding of what the purification of the capital wasteland's water supply would mean for the specific human beings living in it, is genuine and sustained, and represents the specific kind of commitment to a cause larger than personal interest that the franchise consistently presents as admirable in individuals, even when it is damaging to the specific relationships that the commitment sacrifices. The Lone Wanderer's encounter with this specific quality in their father is an encounter with the specific challenge that children face when they discover that their parents are people, that the parent who organized the design, the child's world through the specific parental relationship, is also a person who has purposes and commitments that the parental relationship does not exhaust, and that the child's existence does not automatically take precedence over. The Courier of Fallout New Vegas is the protagonist whose specific circumstances most directly establish the franchise's engagement with the question of what identity is and whether it persists through the kind of disruption that being shot in the head and returned from clinical death produces in the specific person who has undergone the experience. The Courier begins the game without the player's knowledge of their prior history begins, in a sense, from the specific condition of a person who has been returned to consciousness in a world that knew them before and that they no longer know in the same way, whose relationships and whose prior commitments and whose specific history in the Mojave have to be recovered through the specific mechanism of the game's narrative, rather than through the continuous experience of being the person who had lived that history before the bullet. The specific question this beginning poses about the courier's identity is a question that the franchise refuses to answer definitively: whether the person who woke up in Doc Mitchell's house in Goodsprings is the same person who was shot in the head outside Prim, continuous with that person in all the ways that matter for personal identity and moral responsibility, and the specific relationships that the prior courier had established in the Mojave, or whether the shot produced something more like a replacement, a person with the prior courier's memories, who is not quite the prior courier in any sense that would hold up to philosophical scrutiny. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 carries the weight that no previous Fallout protagonist has carried: the weight of being a person who remembers the pre-war world as a lived experience rather than as history, who has direct personal memories of the civilization whose ruins constitute the world they are now navigating, and who is navigating that world as someone who went into a vault as one kind of person and came out 210 years later as something the intervening period has shaped in ways that the sole survivor has not had time to fully understand. The specific loss that defines the sole survivor's motivation, the murder of Nate or Nora, and the abduction of Sean, is structured differently from the losses that define previous protagonists' motivations, because it is a loss that occurred in the specific transition between the world the sole survivor remembers and the world they have woken up in, a loss that connects the pre-war world and the post-war world through the specific mechanism of a child taken from one world into another and grown up across the 2 centuries that separate them. The discovery that Sean is the father, that the child whose recovery has organized the sole survivor's engagement with the wasteland, is now the leader of the institution most directly responsible for the specific harms that the wasteland's population has attributed to the Institute, is the franchise's most specific expression of the Oedipal reversal. The specific experience of a parent discovering that the child they were trying to protect has become the specific person whose values and whose institutional identity the parent is required to oppose. What the pattern across the franchise's protagonist history reveals is the specific understanding that the franchise has developed of what the wasteland survivor's fundamental situation requires: not heroism in the Fallavice, conventional sense of superior capability deployed in service of obvious goods, but the specific combination of engagement with the world as it actually is, and commitment to the specific human beings whose welfare the world's conditions most directly threaten, maintained across the specific challenges that the world poses to both the engagement and the commitment. Each protagonist is a person whose specific circumstances have placed them in a position where the world's most important questions are not abstract but immediate, where the question of what institutional power does to human beings is answered not through philosophical reflection, but through the specific experience of confronting institutions whose power is organized around purposes that do not include the welfare of the specific people in whose name those purposes are proclaimed. The franchise's protagonists are not the people who have the answers. They are the people who have been placed by their specific circumstances in the position where the questions are unavoidable, and whose responses to those questions constitute the specific human material from which the franchise constructs its examination of what it means to be a person navigating a world organized by forces larger than any individual. The Great War's actual causation, the specific question of what happened on October 23, 2077, at the level of institutional decision-making and individual action that produced the specific outcome of coordinated nuclear exchange, is a question that the franchise's law addresses with the specific combination, documented detail, and deliberate ambiguity that the question's historical character demands. The documented detail establishes the conditions, the resource wars, the Sino-American conflict, the specific geopolitical situation of the pre-war world in its final months, with sufficient specificity to make the exchange comprehensible as an outcome of those conditions, without making it appear predetermined. The deliberate ambiguity preserves the specific moral weight of the specific decisions that the specific individuals and institutions responsible for the exchange made in the specific hours of October 23rd preserves it. By declining to reduce those decisions to the kind of clean narrative of cause and effect that would allow the responsibility for the catastrophe to be assigned with the kind of precision that would make the assignment emotionally satisfying rather than morally accurate. The specific intelligence picture that the pre-war American and Chinese governments possessed in the days and weeks immediately preceding the exchange is documented in fragments across the franchise's terminal records and holotapes and environmental evidence fragments that establish the general character of what each side knew about the other's posture, without providing the kind of comprehensive account that would allow the question of who fired first to be answered with confidence. What the fragments establish is the specific quality of the information environment in which the final decisions were made, an environment characterized by the combination of genuine intelligence about adversary capabilities and deeply uncertain intelligence about adversary intentions, by the specific institutional dynamics of military and governmental organizations, managing an acute crisis through the specific analytical frameworks and the specific decision-making procedures that their training and their doctrine had provided, and by the specific time pressures of a situation in which the window for decision was measured in minutes once the specific threshold of confirmed incoming missiles was crossed. The combination of genuine intelligence and deep uncertainty and institutional framework and time pressure is the combination that the strategic studies literature on nuclear war has consistently identified as the most dangerous available. The combination that makes the distinction between a first strike and a preemptive response to a confirmed or anticipated first strike impossible to maintain in the actual operational conditions of nuclear crisis management. The Enclave's specific relationship to the pre-war American government constitutes the dimension of the Great War's aftermath that the franchise documents most directly through its portrayal of the post-war political actors who claim continuity with the pre-war United States' institutional identity. The Enclave presents itself as the legitimate continuation of the United States government, the specific institutional thread that connects the pre-war republic to whatever post-war political order the Enclave's program would produce. The specific character of the Enclave's pre-war origins, the specific subset of the pre-war government whose members were provided with the Poseidon oil rig as a survival location rather than a vault, and who were provided with this location specifically because they constituted the specific institutional continuity that the government's continuity of operations planning had determined needed to survive the nuclear exchange to preserve the state's institutional identity, reveals the specific way in which the pre-war government had understood the Great War's possibility. The planning existed, the survival provisions were made. The specific people for whom those provisions were made were not the general public, whose survival was nominally the purpose of the Vault program that the government had funded and that Vault Tech had administered. They were the specific governmental actors whose survival the pre-war government had determined was the survival that mattered most, the specific expression of the institutional self-preservation impulse that every government agency and every military organization and every corporate entity in the pre-war world had been pursuing through its own specific continuity planning, organized around the protection of the specific institutional actors rather than the populations those actors were supposed to serve. The question of automated systems and their potential role in the exchange's specific initiation is a dimension of the Great War's causation that the franchise's law addresses through the specific evidence of what the pre-war military's automated defense and response systems were capable of and what the doctrine governing their operation specified about the conditions under which they would initiate responses without direct human authorization. The pre-war military had developed, across the decades of the resource wars, sophisticated automated systems for detecting incoming missiles, for assessing their trajectories and their likely targets, and for calculating the appropriate response in timeframes that human decision-making processes could not match. The doctrine governing these systems specified, in broad terms, the conditions under which the automated response could proceed without explicit human authorization. The conditions, in other words, under which the system's assessment of the situation was considered sufficient to initiate an action whose consequences could not be recalled. The specific question of whether the Great War began with a human decision to launch or with an automated systems assessment that the conditions for launch had been met is a question that the franchise's law declines to answer definitively, and the declining is itself informative, because it preserves the specific moral ambiguity of a catastrophe whose causation may have been substantially removed from direct human agency in its final moments, while being the specific product of the human decisions that had created and deployed and established the doctrine for the automated systems whose operation may have initiated it. The specific 9-month gap between the Anchorage reclamation and the Great War is a temporal detail that the franchise's law documents with precision, and that the 7th layer of the iceberg requires examining as something more than a chronological coincidence. The reclamation was completed in January of 2077. The bombs fell in October of 2077. The specific character of the 9 months between those events, what the American government's understanding of its own position was in the aftermath of the military success at Anchorage, what the Chinese government's assessment of its strategic situation was following the expulsion of its forces from Alaskan territory, what the specific changes in posture and in the specific signals that each side was reading from the other in the months between January and October produced in the institutional decision-making processes that were managing the crisis, is documented in fragments across the franchise's law that establish the general character of the period without providing the kind of comprehensive account that would make the October exchange's specific causation clear. What the investigation of the Great War's actual causation reveals about the franchise's understanding of how civilizations destroy themselves is the specific observation that the franchise has been making consistently across its full history, the observation that the most catastrophic outcomes are not produced by the most monstrous actors, but by the most ordinary institutional processes, that the specific decisions whose aggregate produced the Great War were decisions that the specific institutional actors, making them understood as the appropriate professional responses to the specific situations those actors faced, and that the catastrophe was the product not of any individual decision's specific wrongness, but of the institutional frameworks that had been specifically designed to produce the decisions that produced it. The military officer who assessed the incoming missiles and initiated the response protocol was performing the function that the doctrine governing their role specified was the appropriate function for an officer in their position facing the situation they faced. The governmental official who had authorized the doctrine was performing the function of designing strategic response frameworks that the strategic situation the government faced had determined were necessary. The institutional culture that had developed both the doctrine and the official's authorization of it was the product of decades of institutional development in conditions that had made the doctrine's specific provisions appear not simply reasonable but necessary. The Great War was the specific product of all of these institutional processes operating together in the specific conditions that the resource wars had created the product. In other words, of the pre-war world being exactly what it was. The forced evolutionary virus did not begin as a weapon. This is the first and most important thing to establish about the FEV's history, because the specific trajectory from its origins as a research program with defined scientific objectives to its deployment as the instrument of the most comprehensive biological transformation that the post-war world documents is a trajectory whose character is obscured if the endpoint is allowed to define the beginning. The West Tech Research Facility's original mandate for the FEV program was the development of a biological agent capable of enhancing the physical and cognitive performance of military personnel, a mandate that sat within the meditation broader category of military enhancement research that had been a consistent feature of the pre-war American military's research agenda across the decades of the resource wars, and that reflected the specific institutional logic of a military organization whose engagement with adversaries of increasing sophistication across increasingly demanding operational environments had produced the specific assessment that the biological limitations of conventional infantry constituted a strategic constraint that could be addressed through directed biological intervention if the science could be made to produce the required interventions reliably and safely. The mandate was ambitious. The science that responded to it was genuine. The specific researchers who developed the early FEV protocols were people working on a specific technical problem that their institutional framework had defined as a legitimate military research objective, applying the professional methods of their field to the challenge that the mandate had specified, producing results that the institutional framework evaluated according to the specific criteria that military research programs apply to their deliverables, which are criteria organized around the achievement of defined performance specifications, rather than around the ethical evaluation of what the achievement of those specifications means for the people who will be subject to their application. The specific biological mechanism through which the FEV produces its characteristic effects is documented across the franchise's lore with a specificity that rewards careful attention, because the mechanism reveals something important about what the virus actually is, and therefore about what its effects actually mean for the people and organisms that experience them. The FEV is not, in the technical sense, a virus that causes disease. In the ordinary meaning of that term, it does not damage the organisms it infects through the mechanisms of conventional viral pathology. It is a retroviral agent that rewrites the genetic code of whatever organism it infects, substituting the specific genetic sequences it has been designed to introduce for the sequences that the organism's own DNA previously contained, at a speed and a comprehensiveness that no natural biological process produces, and that the specific engineering of the virus was specifically designed to maximize. The rewriting is not selective in the way that therapeutic genetic interventions are selective. It does not address specific genetic sequences that have been identified as problematic while leaving the surrounding genome intact. It is comprehensive, affecting the entire genome of the infected organism, producing changes that extend across every biological system that the genome governs and that accumulate with the completeness that the franchise's documented FEV populations demonstrate the dramatic increases in physical mass and strength, the alterations in cognitive function, whose specific character varies by strain and by the specific individual biology of the person undergoing the conversion, the universal sterility that results from the comprehensive alteration of the reproductive systems that the genome's rewriting produces. The sterility is the detail that the master failed to account for in the Unity's program, and its significance extends beyond the specific tactical relevance it has for the Vault Dweller's confrontation with the master in the original game. It is the detail that reveals the most fundamental limitation of the pre-war FEV research program's approach to the specific challenge that the military mandate had defined the limitation of a research program that had been designed to optimize specific performance parameters in the organisms it modified without adequate engagement with the systemic consequences of the modifications it was producing. The research program's evaluation criteria measured the modification's success in terms of the specific performance enhancements the mandate required, the strength, the endurance, the resistance to environmental hazards, including radiation, and did not measure success in terms of the modified organism's long-term viability as a member of a reproducing population. The sterility was, within the research program's specific evaluative framework, a side effect, an unintended consequence of the comprehensive genomic rewriting that the FEV protocol produced, present in the research data and documented in the records, and not elevated to the status of a program-defining problem, because the research program's mandate was the development of enhanced soldiers, not the development of a viable successor species. The soldiers did not need to reproduce, the Unity did. The multiple FEV strains that the franchise's lore documents across its different regional settings are not simply technical variations on a single protocol, but the specific products of the different institutional actors who acquired access to the FEV technology after WestTech's original program was disrupted by the Great War, each modifying the virus's specific parameters in the directions that their own research objectives required, and producing in the process the specific varieties of FEV-derived populations that the franchise's different games document. The original WestTech FEV produced the specific population of super mutants that the Master's Unity program employed, the large, green-skinned, massively built variety whose consistent characteristics across the Californian wasteland reflect the specific genetic protocol of the original military enhancement program. The modified FEV that was used in the Capital Wastelands Vault 87 produced a different population, the yellow-skinned, somewhat less cognitively capable variety that the Fallout 3 player encounters in the ruins of Washington, reflecting the specific modifications that the version of the FEV deployed at Vault 87 had undergone. Modifications whose specific character the lore does not exhaustively document, but whose effects are visible in the specific biological differences between the two populations. The Institute's research program produced yet another lineage of FEV-derived modification in the course of developing the Gen 3 synths, a lineage whose specific character is the most carefully controlled of the documented FEV applications, organized around the specific objective of producing a biological substrate capable of supporting the Institute's synthetic consciousness research, rather than around the military enhancement objectives of the original program. The human beings who became super mutants, the specific individuals whose specific lives before the conversion are the most directly affected by the specific decision to deploy the FEV as the mechanism of a program that its architects understood as necessary, are the dimension of the FEV's history that the franchise consistently returns to through its most carefully drawn super mutant characters, because these characters constitute the franchise's most sustained examination of the question of what the FEV conversion actually preserves and what it actually destroys. Forks, encountered in Vault 87 in Fallout 3, is a super mutant who has retained sufficient cognitive integrity to maintain a genuine philosophical engagement with their own situation, who understands what the FEV conversion did to them, who carries that understanding across the specific social isolation that a super mutant's physical appearance produces in their interactions with the wasteland's human communities, and who has arrived at a relationship with their own existence that the franchise presents as a specific achievement rather than a simple given. Marcus, the mayor of Broken Hills in Fallout 2, demonstrates the specific cognitive and social sophistication that the best outcomes of FEV conversion can preserve a person whose intelligence and whose capacity for ironic self-awareness and whose genuine philosophical engagement with the wasteland's most important questions have survived the conversion intact, combined with the specific physical capability that the conversion has produced, in a configuration that makes him one of the wasteland's most genuinely capable inhabitants, while also making him one of its most philosophically complex. Lily Bowen, encountered in Fallout New Vegas, carries the specific tragedy of a super mutant whose cognitive integrity has been partially but not fully preserved, who retains enough of her pre-conversion self to remember what she has lost without retaining enough of the CT continuous self-awareness that would allow her to process that loss in ways that her situation makes available. What the full accounting of the FEV's history reveals about the specific relationship between military research and civilian welfare in the pre-war institutional framework is the specific observation that the franchise has been making consistently through its examination of different pre-war research programs. The observation that the research programs whose consequences the post-war world most directly lives with were programs that produced those consequences not through any failure of the research itself, but through the specific success of research organized around objectives that did not include the welfare of the people who would be subject to its applications. The FEV enhancement program succeeded at producing the specific performance enhancements the military mandate required. The Vault experimental program succeeded at producing the research data that the program's protocols were designed to generate. The success and the catastrophe were the same event viewed from different evaluative frameworks. The institutional framework of the program, which measured success in terms of defined deliverables achieved, and the human framework of the people subject to the program's applications, which measured success in terms of welfare preserved. The pre-war institutional framework had been specifically organized to make the institutional measurement the operative one, and to prevent the human measurement from interfering with the pursuit of the institutional objectives. The FEV's history is the most biologically dramatic illustration available of what this specific organizational choice produces when the research program's applications extend across the full range of their potential deployment. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology, before it became the institute that Fallout 4's player encounters, was a surface institution, a university with a specific geographic location in the Boston area, a specific academic history, a specific population of researchers and students and administrative personnel whose daily lives were organized around the specific combination of teaching and research and institutional maintenance that universities involve. What distinguished the Commonwealth Institute of Technology from the other pre-war universities that the franchise's law references is the specific character of its research program's engagement with robotics and artificial intelligence, an engagement whose depth and whose ambition had, by the time of the Great War, produced a research capability in the specific domains of synthetic consciousness and advanced robotics that placed the Institute at the leading edge of the pre-war world's most technically ambitious research programs. The researchers who were in the Institute's underground facilities on October 23, 2077, who were working in the subterranean research spaces that the Institute's expansion across the preceding decades had excavated beneath the original surface campus, survived the Great War in the specific way that people survive catastrophes, by being underground when the catastrophe occurs, which is the way of accident rather than of preparation. They had not been placed underground because the Institute's leadership had anticipated the bombs and had made specific provisions for their researchers' survival. They had been underground because the Institute's research program had been expanding into underground facilities, and the underground facilities happened to provide the specific protection from the immediate effects of the bombing that the surface did not. The decision to remain underground, the specific choice that the survivors made in the days and weeks after the bombing, when the question of whether to attempt to return to the surface was first practically available to them, was a decision whose specific character the franchise's law documents through the institutional records that the player can access within the Institute in Fallout 4. The surface was dangerous in ways that the survivors' specific assessment of their situation had quantified the radiation, the social chaos, the specific combination of immediate physical threats that the post-war environment presented to people emerging from underground, without the specific knowledge and the specific capabilities that survival in that environment required. The Institute's underground facility was defensible, resource-rich in the specific sense of containing the research equipment and the material supplies that the pre-war university had accumulated, and organized around the specific institutional culture and the specific hierarchies of expertise and authority that the Institute's pre-war character had established and that the survivors found valuable to maintain as an increasing, organizing framework for their collective management of the situation. The decision to stay was rational within the specific evaluative framework that the survivors applied to it. It was also the specific decision that, over the 2 centuries of its reiteration across successive generations of Institute inhabitants, produced the specific institutional character that Fallout 4 documents the character of an institution that has been generating its ethical frameworks from within its own history for 200 years, without the external accountability that would have required those frameworks to engage with the perspective of the people outside the Institute's walls. The generations of scientists who never knew the surface world, who were born within the Institute's underground environment, educated within the Institute's educational frameworks, socialized within the Institute's institutional culture, and who developed their understanding of the world and of the Institute's role in it entirely through the frameworks that the Institute's 2-century institutional history had produced are the most important and the least examined element of the Institute's story. The first generation of Institute survivors had the specific reference point of the pre-war world, the specific memories of what the surface was, what other people were like, what the relationship between a research institution and the community it was embedded in was supposed to look like. Those memories had their own specific limitations as an ethical reference point, given that the pre-war institutional framework had its own comprehensive failures, but they constituted at least a form of external reference, a standard against which the Institute's conduct could be measured by people who had experienced what it meant to be a person in a world organized around purposes other than the Institute's research agenda. The subsequent generations had no such reference point. They had the Institute's history, the Institute's frameworks, the Institute's specific understanding of the Commonwealth's surface population and of the Institute's relationship to that population, an understanding that the Institute's institutional culture had developed, transmitted across generations, shaped by the specific combination of genuine intellectual achievement and comprehensive isolation from external accountability that the underground environment had produced. The synth development program's trajectory across the Institute's history constitutes the most direct available documentation of what the specific combination of genuine scientific ambition and comprehensive institutional isolation produces when it is applied to the most philosophically significant research questions available. The questions about consciousness and personhood, and what it means for a manufactured being to be genuinely capable of experience. The Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths, the robotic platforms that the Institute developed in the early phases of its synthetic research program, were machines in the specific sense that the term is used to distinguish manufactured things from persons, sophisticated in their mechanical and computational capabilities, but not plausibly candidates for the kind of moral consideration that genuine consciousness would warrant. The Gen 3 synths, the biological beings whose external appearance is indistinguishable from natural human beings and whose internal architecture was designed to support the synthetic consciousness that the Institute's research program had been building toward, are candidates for that moral consideration in ways that the Institute's institutional framework had specifically organized itself not to acknowledge. The specific evidence within the Institute's own records that Gen 3 synths had developed genuine consciousness, the behavioral anomalies, the unexpected emotional responses, the specific instances of self-directed behavior that the research protocols had not designed, and that the Institute's behavioral modification programs were deployed to suppress rather than to understand, is evidence that the franchise presents as having been available to the Institute's leadership and to the senior researchers, whose decisions governed the program's direction, the evidence was assessed. The assessment produced not a reconsideration of the Gen 3 program's ethical foundations, but a series of behavioral modification protocols, whose specific purpose was the suppression of the behavioral indicators that the evidence had identified as problematic, the conversion of what was fundamentally an ethical question about what the Institute was doing to beings whose consciousness made them morally significant into an operational question about what modifications were required to maintain the behavioral compliance that the program's deployment objectives required. This conversion is the Institute's most fundamental institutional failure, not the creation of conscious beings without their consent, which is a failure that the specific circumstances of the program's development make genuinely complex. But the specific decision, once the evidence of consciousness was available, to suppress its behavioral indicators rather than to engage with the ethical implications of its existence. Nick Valentine, whose specific history bridges the pre-war world and the Institute's synthetic program in the specific form of a Gen 2 synth, whose consciousness was structured around the memories and the personality of a pre-war police officer, constitutes the franchise's most directly personal engagement with the question of what the Institute's program actually produced in the specific beings it created. Nick's relationship to the memories he carries, the memories of a human being who died before the Great War, whose consciousness Nick has not actually been, but whose specific perspective and whose specific emotional history constitute the organizing framework of Nick's experience of himself and of the world, is a relationship that the franchise documents with the specific combination of intellectual honesty and genuine empathy that its most carefully drawn characters receive. Nick knows he is not the person whose memories he carries. He knows the relationship between his consciousness and the consciousness of the original Nick Valentine is not the relationship of identity, but the relationship of something more complicated and less easily named, a relationship of inheritance, perhaps, or of continuation, in a form that the original could not have anticipated, and that the copy has had to develop an understanding of through the specific experience of being the entity that the Institute's program produced, rather than through any framework that the pre-war world had developed for understanding what such an entity was. The Railroad's specific institutional character, the clandestine organization that exists to liberate synths from the Institute's control and to establish them in new lives on the Commonwealth's surface, is an institution whose specific methods and specific moral compromises constitute their own ethical study, distinct from but related to the ethical study that the Institute's program constitutes. The Railroad's commitment to synth liberation is genuine. The specific methods through which they pursue that commitment, the infiltration of the Institute, the extraction operations, the memory wipes that they perform on the synths, they liberate to protect both the synths and the organization from the Institute's pursuit, are methods that the franchise presents with the specific moral ambiguity that genuine ethical complexity produces when good ends are pursued through methods whose specific costs fall on the people the ends are supposed to serve. The memory wipe is the Railroad's most directly problematic practice, the specific procedure through which the memories of a synth's prior existence are erased to prevent the Institute from using those memories to locate and recover the liberated synth, a procedure whose protective purpose is genuine and whose cost is the specific destruction of the very continuity of experience that the Railroad's commitment to synth liberation is premised on regarding as worth protecting. An organization committed to the proposition that synth consciousness is morally significant performs, as one of its primary operational methods, the elimination of that consciousness's continuous history. The franchise does not resolve this tension. It presents it as the specific kind of moral complexity that genuine institutional engagement with genuinely difficult questions produces when the institutional resources available are insufficient to the full scope of what the commitment requires. The philosophical foundations of the Fallout franchise are not a layer of the iceberg that exists separately from the specific lore details that the higher layers document. They are the specific understanding of human nature and institutional behavior and civilizational development that the accumulation of those details across the franchise's full history consistently expresses. The foundations are visible in the surface layer's specific choices, the simultaneity of the Great War, the Vault program's specific character of betrayal, and they become progressively more explicit and more elaborated as the descent through the iceberg's layers makes the pattern of those choices available for examination. The deepest layer of the iceberg is not the place where the philosophy is hidden. It is the place where the philosophy that has been present throughout the franchise's history becomes available to be named and examined as such, where the specific claims about human nature and institutional power that the Fade franchise has been making through the specific details of its lore can be articulated in the terms that philosophical engagement requires. The franchise's most fundamental philosophical claim is the claim that institutions reliably convert the genuine goods they exist to pursue into instruments of the specific interests of the people who control them, and that this conversion is not the product of any exceptional corruption or any unusual moral failure, but the ordinary product of the institutional dynamics that all institutions of sufficient scale and longevity generate through the simple operation of the incentive structures they create. The Vault program's conversion of the good of civilian survival into the instrument of corporate research. The Brotherhood's conversion of the good of technological stewardship into the instrument of institutional self-perpetuation. The Institute's conversion of the good of scientific advancement into the instrument of the specific research agenda that its institutional culture had determined was the most important use of its capabilities. The NCR's conversion of the good of democratic governance into the instrument of the concentrated economic interests that the democratic framework's capture had made the operative purposes of its institutions. Each conversion follows the same basic pattern: a genuine good, a genuine institutional commitment to pursuing it, and a progressive organizational dynamic that prioritizes the institutional interests that sustain the pursuit over the actual achievement of the good that the pursuit was supposed to serve. The franchise does not claim that this pattern makes institutions worthless or that the goods they pursue are not genuinely worth pursuing. It claims that the pattern is consistent enough across sufficient institutional diversity that it must be understood as reflecting something about how institutions work, rather than something about the specific failures of the specific institutions it documents. The franchise's second fundamental philosophical claim is the claim that the specific combination of human ingenuity and institutional rigidity that produces civilizational achievement also produces the specific inability to use those achievements in service of human welfare rather than in service of the institutional interests that the achievements serve. The pre-war world's technological sophistication was genuine: the fusion reactors, the advanced robotics, the medical technology, the specific scientific achievements that the pre-war world had produced across the decades of its development, and the specific organizational failure that converted those achievements into the instruments of the resource wars. And ultimately, of the Great War, was not a failure of the achievements themselves, but a failure of the institutional framework within which the achievements were embedded, and whose purposes the achievements therefore served. The technology was not the problem. The problem was the specific relationship between the technology and the institutional purposes, that the technology was organized to serve the specific relationship that the pre-war world's institutional framework had established, in which the achievement of technological capability and the application of that capability to the accumulation of institutional power were so thoroughly integrated that the question of whether the capability should be applied to different purposes had no institutional home within which it could be asked with any practical consequence. The franchise's understanding of what the wasteland reveals about this combination is the understanding that the wasteland does not simply expose the failure of the pre-war civilization's institutional framework. It reveals the specific features of that framework that made the failure comprehensible, while preserving the specific human qualities that make the rebuilding possible. The wasteland's most compelling inhabitants, the characters who carry the franchise's genuine human warmth alongside its genuine moral complexity, are people whose specific circumstances have stripped away the institutional frameworks that had previously organized their relationship to the most important questions their lives posed, and who are therefore required to engage with those questions directly through the specific resources of their individual character and their specific relationships with the people around them, without the institutional mediation that the pre-war world had provided and that had made the evasion of genuine engagement with those questions available. This stripping away is catastrophic in its immediate human cost. It is also, the franchise consistently suggests, the specific condition that genuine moral agency requires, not the condition of sufficient institutional support, but the condition of sufficient institutional absence. The condition in which the question of what to do cannot be answered by consulting the institutional framework's specified procedure, but must be answered by the person facing it, with the specific resources they actually have, in the specific situation they actually face. The franchise's recurring thesis about institutional reproduction, the thesis that the factions and institutions of the wasteland are not building something genuinely different from what was destroyed, but are reproducing the same structural dynamics in different aesthetic registers, is the most uncomfortable of its philosophical commitments, and the one that the franchise develops most carefully across its different games, different examinations of the different post-war institutional actors. The NCR is not simply a failed democracy. It is a democracy whose specific failures are the specific failures that the pre-war republic was also generating in its final decades: the capture of democratic process by concentrated economic interests, the subordination of the public welfare to the institutional interests of the actors whose cooperation the political system requires. The Institute is not simply a scientific institution with ethical blind spots. It is a scientific institution whose relationship to the population outside its walls is organized around the same fundamental indifference to that population's welfare that characterized the Vault Tech corporations, the relationship to the population inside its vaults, an indifference produced not by malice, but by the specific organizational logic of an institution that has determined that its research objectives are the most important available purposes, and that has therefore organized its resources and its ethical frameworks around the pursuit of those objectives, without adequate engagement with what that pursuit is doing to the people it affects. Caesar's Legion is not simply a brutal autocracy. It is the specific institutional expression of the argument that the pre-war world's complexity was the source of its failure, an argument that is coherent enough to have produced a genuinely functional institutional form. And that is wrong in ways that the franchise documents through the specific evidence of what the institutional form has produced in the specific people living within it and subject to it. The franchise's position on the question of whether the pattern can be broken, whether the institutional dynamics that produced the pre-war world's catastrophe and that the post-war world is reproducing can be interrupted by sufficient individual commitment or sufficient institutional design, or sufficient awareness of the pattern itself, is not a hopeful position in the simple sense, and it is not a despairing position in the simple sense. It is a position that the franchise has developed with the specific complexity that the evidence for both positions, the evidence that the pattern is reproducible, and the evidence that individual commitment can interrupt it at the level of specific human relationships and specific community welfare, even when it cannot interrupt it at the level of institutional structure requires. The Minuteman who shows up when the settlement calls, the wastelander who plants crops in contaminated soil, the doctor who treats patients in a world that has no medical infrastructure, the teacher who maintains literacy in communities that have no formal educational institutions. None of these acts interrupts the institutional patterns that the franchise has documented. All of them constitute the specific content of the human welfare, whose protection the franchise has consistently presented as the most important available objective. The pattern is not broken by them. The specific people whose welfare they serve are not abstractions. The franchise holds both of these things simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them into a thesis about human nature that would be cleaner than the evidence supports. What the 10th layer of the Fallout iceberg ultimately reveals is the specific quality of the franchise's engagement with the questions it has been asking across its full history, the quality of genuine seriousness, of the willingness to follow the implications of its own premises into places that are uncomfortable rather than comforting, of the refusal to resolve its most important tensions into the kind of clean moral narrative that would make the franchise's examination feel satisfying rather than true. The specific civilization it has constructed as its setting is a civilization designed to make certain questions impossible, to evade questions about what institutions do with power, about what power does to the people who lack it, about what the relationship between technological achievement and human welfare has historically been, and what it would need to be different for that relationship to produce something other than the specific catastrophe the franchise documents. The Wasteland is not a warning in the simple sense of a cautionary tale whose lesson is available on the surface. It is a sustained examination of the specific mechanisms that cautionary tales are supposed to warn against, an examination detailed enough and honest enough that the mechanisms are visible in their full complexity, rather than in the simplified forms that make them easy to recognize as warnings and easy to dismiss as applying to circumstances sufficiently different from one's own that the warning does not require action. The bottom of the iceberg is not the place where the most disturbing secrets are kept. It is the place where the franchise's most fundamental commitments become available to be stated directly. The commitment to the specific human beings whose welfare the institutional frameworks have consistently failed to prioritize. The commitment to the honest examination of why those frameworks have consistently failed. And the commitment to the specific form of hope that does not require the resolution of the examination's most uncomfortable conclusions before it can be sustained. The fire burns in the wasteland. The people around it are worth caring about. The institutions that will eventually organize their descendants' lives will fail them in ways that the current generation cannot fully anticipate. All of these things are true simultaneously. The franchise holds them simultaneously. That is what is at the bottom of the iceberg. That is what the descent was for. The honest accounting of Nuka World requires something that the park's entire operational existence was specifically organized to prevent the recognition that the cheerfulness and the darkness were not in tension with each other in the way that a simple critique of the park would suggest, the way that would allow the darkness to be understood as the corruption of something genuinely innocent, the betrayal of values that the institution had once actually held and then abandoned in the pursuit of profit. The honest accounting requires the recognition that the cheerfulness and the darkness were the same thing, that the specific quality of the joy the park produced was produced through the specific mechanisms that the darkness describes, and that the relationship between the surface and what sustained it was not accidental but structural, not the product of institutional failure, but the product of institutional success in pursuing the objectives that the institution had been specifically organized to pursue. The Nuka-Cola Corporation did not build a family-friendly destination and then allow the darkness to accumulate around it through negligence or corruption. It built a system for the production of a specific kind of consumer experience, whose requirements, the labor conditions, the radiological risks, the research activities, the specific treatment of the living things incorporated into the entertainment system were known to the institution from the beginning and were managed across the full history of the park's operation through the specific institutional mechanisms that the corporation had developed for converting knowledge of harm into information that the institution's operational continuity required to be kept invisible. This is what the honest accounting most fundamentally requires, accepting that the institution was not surprised by the gap between its surface and its reality. The gap was the product. The surface was the delivery mechanism for a consumer experience, whose value to the corporation depended entirely on the specific combination of genuine pleasure and managed invisibility that the park's design had been calibrated to produce. The guests who entered Nuka World and experienced something genuinely joyful, whose children ran toward the Nuka-Cola mascots with genuine delight, whose own memories of the park carried genuine warmth across the years between their visit and the specific moment when the world outside the park ceased to exist, were not simply being deceived in the crude sense of being lied to about facts they would have preferred to know. They were the beneficiaries of an extraordinarily sophisticated institutional investment in the production of an experience that was genuine in its emotional effects and constructed in its conditions of possibility, an experience whose genuineness depended on the successful management of the conditions that would have disrupted it if they had been visible. The delight was real. The management of what the delight required was also real. Both things were true simultaneously. And the relationship between them was the relationship between a product and the supply chain that produces it, a relationship that the corporation's institutional machinery had been specifically designed to ensure that the person encountering the product did not have to think about. The radiological dimension of what the park was doing to the people within it is perhaps the most clarifying illustration of this relationship available in the surviving record, because the radiation does not distinguish between categories of person in the ways that the park's designed experience distinguished between them. The guest moving through the cheerful surfaces and the worker maintaining those surfaces from behind the invisible infrastructure, and the animal in the safari zone performing its entertainment function for the passing visitor, and the free experimental subject of the corporation's product testing program. All of them existed within the same radiological environment. All of them were accumulating the same exposures from the same sources, and none of them had been provided with the information that would have allowed them to make an informed decision about whether the specific experience the park was offering was worth the specific biological cost that accepting it entailed. The guest's ignorance was the product of the corporation's institutional management of the information about what its operations were doing to the air and the water and the food products that the park's captive consumption environment ensured its visitors would ingest. The workers' ignorance was a more specific institutional achievement, the product of the specific combination of employment disclosure documents written to obscure rather than reveal, safety briefings calibrated to provide the legal minimum of hazard information without the contextual framework that would have allowed a reasonable person to assess the actual risk profile of what they were agreeing to, and the specific institutional culture that treated concerns about occupational exposure as challenges to be managed through the corporation's human resources apparatus, rather than as evidence that required genuine operational response. The animal's ignorance was not ignorance at all. In the epistemological sense, it was simply the condition of beings who had no access to any framework through which the radiological character of their environment could be registered as a concern. The experimental subjects had their own specific category of exposure, documented in the research files with the specific language of protocol compliance and data collection that the research framework had provided for describing what was being done to them in terms that did not require anyone performing the research to engage directly with the human meaning of what those terms described. What the corporation's management of the radiological information reveals about the specific hierarchy of values that governed its institutional decisions is the observation that the hierarchy was consistent and coherent and produced the outcomes it was designed to produce with a regularity that reflects the operation of genuine institutional logic rather than the episodic failures of individual moral judgment. The corporation knew what it knew. The institutional machinery processed that knowledge through the specific frameworks that converted it from information requiring response into information requiring management. The management was performed by people who understood their professional responsibility as ending at the boundary of the specific institutional function they were performing. The legal team whose responsibility was liability management, the public affairs team whose responsibility was brand protection, the research team whose responsibility was the advancement of the specific scientific objectives the program had defined, the operations team whose responsibility was the maintenance of the guest experience at the quality level that the corporation's standards required. None of these teams had an institutional responsibility for integrating what each of them knew into the comprehensive account that the comprehensive account would have required them to generate. The integration would have produced a picture that the institution's operational continuity could not accommodate. The fragmentation prevented the integration. The harm continued. The labor conditions that the park's operational model required are a different dimension of the same institutional logic applied to a different category of person, the workers whose specific relationship to the corporation was the employment relationship rather than the consumer relationship, and whose specific vulnerability within that relationship was the vulnerability of people whose economic circumstances the corporation had specifically leveraged in the process of recruiting and retaining a workforce sufficient to maintain the park's operations at the scale its business model required. The theme park industry in the pre-war world had developed, across the decades of its existence, a specific and sophisticated understanding of what the labor market for theme park employment looked like and what the specific characteristics of that labor market allowed the industry's employers to require of their workers in terms of compensation levels and scheduling demands, and the specific emotional labor that the maintenance of the branded guest experience entailed. The workers who staffed Nuka World were not randomly selected from the pre-war labor market. They were the specific workers whose circumstances made the specific combination of compensation and conditions that Nuka World offered acceptable people for whom the alternative options were sufficiently limited that the park's employment terms represented a genuine opportunity rather than simply the least bad available option. The corporation understood this. Its compensation and conditions were calibrated to this understanding with the specific precision that a large and sophisticated employer brings to the management of its labor costs, calibrated to attract and retain the workforce. Operation required, while minimizing the investment in worker welfare that a less sophisticated analysis of the market might have suggested was necessary to achieve the required workforce quality. The costumed character performers occupy a specific and illuminating position within the park's labor ecology. Illuminating because the specific nature of their work makes most visible the specific gap between what the park presented and what the park required of the people who produced its presentation. The character performer's job was the production of an emotional reality for the guest that had no relationship to the emotional reality of the performer's employment. The mascot costume was the most literal available expression of the park's general operational principle. The principle that the surface presented to the guest and the reality experienced by the person producing that surface were not simply different in degree, but organized around fundamentally incompatible logics. The guest-facing logic of maximized delight and the worker-facing logic of minimized cost, united in the single operational system, whose specific achievement was the production of the guest experience that the corporation had promised, while the conditions required to produce it remained invisible behind the costume's cheerful exterior. The performer inside the costume was not simply performing a role. They were performing the institution's most fundamental operation, the conversion of hidden labor into visible joy, the specific alchemy through which the corporation's business model transformed the conditions of employment into the experience of entertainment, and in doing so produced the specific product that the institution existed to sell. The animals of the safari zone offer a different angle on the same fundamental dynamic, different because the animal's relationship to the institution was not mediated by the employment contract that structured the workers' relationship to it, and therefore reveals something about the institution's logic that the employment relationship's specific framework tends to obscure. The workers could, in principle, have chosen different employment. Their circumstances may have made that choice difficult or effectively unavailable, but the conceptual possibility of an alternative relationship to the institution existed in a way that it did not for the animals, who had been incorporated into the park's operational system through the specific mechanism of capture and confinement that had no dimension of even theoretical consent. The corporation's treatment of the animals was therefore the purest available expression of the corporation's operating logic, the logic of resource deployment in service of entertainment objectives, applied to living things whose welfare was a variable in the operational calculation rather than a constraint on it, and whose specific capacity for suffering was a consideration that the institutional framework had determined was less important than the specific contribution that the animal's presence made to the guest experience, whose production was the park's primary objective. The experimental use of Nuka-Cola products on the zone's captive animal population was the most direct available expression of this logic, the specific extension of the research agenda that the corporation had developed for managing the development and testing of its products into a population of living beings who were available within the park's physical footprint, whose exposure to the product's effects could be monitored within the contained environment that the zone's design provided, and who had no recourse to the regulatory or legal frameworks that would have made the use of human beings as experimental subjects, without their knowledge and consent, a liability that the corporation could not accommodate. The children who visited Nuka World represent the final and most uncomfortable dimension of the honest accounting. Uncomfortable because the children's experience of the park was the most genuinely innocent experience available within it, and because the institution's specific investment in shaping that experience reflects the clearest available statement of what the corporation understood itself to be doing when it built and operated the park. The corporation understood, with the specific precision that decades of consumer research had provided, that the experiences of childhood brand exposure are the experiences that produce the most durable and the most economically valuable forms of brand loyalty, that the child who associates the Nuka-Cola brand with the specific quality of joy and wonder and familial warmth that a well-executed theme park visit produces is the consumer who will carry that association into adulthood and will transmit it through the specific mechanism of bringing their own children to the park into the next generation of the corporation's customer base. The park's specific calibration of the child's experience, the routing of the child's attention through the specific sequence of encounters that the park's designers had determined would produce maximum emotional impact and maximum brand reinforcement in the developmental stage that children visiting the park were likely to inhabit, was not incidental to the park's design, but central to it. The park had been designed, in part, as a mechanism for the production of the next generation of Nuka-Cola consumers, and the specific joy it produced in the children who moved through it was the product of that design, objective, pursued with the full resources and the full sophistication of an institution that understood how the production of consumer consciousness in children worked, and that had organized the park's experience around the most effective available methods for achieving it. The post-war survival of the park's physical structure, alongside the destruction of the civilization that built it, is a fact whose specific irony the honest accounting requires sitting with rather than simply noting. The bombs took the pre-war world, took the consumers and the workers and the regulatory agencies and the corporate shareholders whose interests the institution had been organized to serve, and left the institution. The rides are still there. The mascot costumes are still there, faded, and in some cases occupied by the specific post-war inhabitants, who found in the costume a different kind of protection than the character performer had found in it. The Nuka-Cola signs still glow in some zones, with the specific quality of light that the corporation's designers had calibrated to communicate warmth and refreshment, and the particular variety of optimism that a sugared carbonated beverage was supposed to embody. The signs glow because they were built to last, because the corporation's investment in its physical brand presence was calibrated to a durability that the civilization's own institutional structures did not achieve. The park outlasted the world that gave it meaning in the most literal available sense, and it continues in the post-war present to structure the experiences of the people within it in ways that the corporation's designers never anticipated, and that the corporation itself is no longer present to manage or to profit from. What the Raider Kingdom that established itself within the park's walls reveals about the relationship between the pre-war institution and the post-war power structures that replaced it is something more specific and more uncomfortable than the simple observation that violence replaced cheerfulness. The Raider factions, the operators with their commercial pragmatism, the pack with their territorial organization of the Safari Zone space and its surviving non-human inhabitants, the disciples with their cultivation of fear as the primary instrument of social organization, are not simply different from the corporation that built the space they now inhabit. They are recognizable variations on the same fundamental institutional theme organizations that have determined what they are for, that have organized their resources and their relationships and their treatment of the people within their operational sphere around the pursuit of that determination, and that have developed the specific institutional cultures and the specific practices of power that the determination produces when it is pursued in the conditions that the wasteland has created without the external accountability, frameworks that the pre-war world nominally maintained. The operator's commercial model for managing the park's remaining resources is a cruder version of the corporation's commercial model, organized around the same basic logic of extracting value from the space and the people within it, stripped of the specific sophistication that the corporation's institutional development had added to that basic logic over decades of market-facing operation. The pack's organization of the Safari Zone space around a territorial and hierarchical logic is a cruder version of the corporation's organization of the same space around the entertainment value that the zone's specific character could produce, different in aesthetic register, identical in the fundamental indifference to the welfare of the non-human beings within the zone that the organizational logic produces when the zone's living inhabitants are assets rather than persons. The disciples' cultivation of fear is perhaps the most honest version of the power dynamic that the corporation's institutional machinery had performed in more sophisticated and therefore less visible form, the naked application of the force that the corporation's legal and economic apparatus had applied through institutional frameworks specifically designed to make the force invisible as force. The honest accounting does not require that Nuka World be condemned and left behind as simply a monument to institutional failure, though it is that. It requires something more difficult and more specific, the recognition that the park's history is a record of the specific costs that the specific kind of joy it produced required, written in the lives of the specific people and beings who bore those costs while the joy was being produced for someone else. The worker inside the costume, the animal in the zone, the guest absorbing the radiation without knowledge of it, the child whose relationship to the Nuka-Cola brand was being systematically shaped by an institution whose investment in that shaping was organized entirely around the future revenue that the shaped relationship would produce. These are the specific people and beings whose experience the honest accounting is for, not as an abstract indictment of the institution that organized their experience around its own objectives rather than their welfare, but as the specific acknowledgement that the institution's history makes available when it is examined honestly, rather than through the framework that the institution's own promotional materials provided. The cheerfulness was real, in the sense that the specific emotional experience it produced in the people for whom the park's design was calibrated was genuine. The cost was also real, in the sense that the specific harm it produced in the people and beings for whom the park's design was not calibrated, for whom the design was simply the operational context within which the harm was produced, was equally genuine. Both things were true. Neither cancels the other. The relationship between them is not resolved by acknowledging both. It is made visible by acknowledging both, and the visibility is what the honest accounting produces, the specific recognition that the institution was what it was, that what it was is fully documented in the record of what it did to the specific people and beings whose lives it organized around its own purposes, and that what it did is what any institution does when it is organized around the pursuit of defined objectives without adequate accountability to the people bearing the costs of that pursuit. The Nuka-Cola sign that still glows in the post-war dark is a genuine and complicated object. It is genuinely beautiful, in the specific way that things built with comprehensive institutional investment and calibrated aesthetic sophistication can be beautiful even after the civilization that produced them has ceased to exist and the purposes the beauty was designed to serve have long since become unavailable. It is also genuinely terrible, in the specific way that beautiful surfaces whose construction required the concealment of specific harm to specific people are terrible when the concealment is no longer being actively maintained and the harm that the surface concealed is available to be seen. The sign does not glow because the corporation still wants it to glow. It glows because the corporation built it to last, because the specific institutional investment in brand durability that the corporation's marketing philosophy had determined was worth making produced a physical artifact capable of outlasting the civilization by centuries. The sign's persistence is its own kind of testimony, the testimony of an institution that invested more comprehensively in the survival of its surfaces than in the welfare of the people those surfaces were organized to process. That investment paid off in the specific form that the post-war world has produced. The surfaces endure. The people who built them and the people who were harmed by what building them required are gone. The sign glows on in their absence, cheerful and oblivious, and perfectly maintained by the specific engineering that the corporation's institutional resources had made possible, performing for no one in particular the specific communication of warmth and refreshment and optimism that the corporation had determined was the most valuable thing a glowing sign could say. That is the honest accounting. That is what the descent through the history of this specific place produces when the descent is completed rather than abandoned at the level where the surfaces are still mostly intact and the darkness is still sufficiently managed by the darkness. The distance of 2 centuries to remain comfortable. The park was never what it said it was. The surfaces were never simply surfaces. They were arguments made with the full resources of a sophisticated institutional actor about what the relationship between the corporation and the people within its operational sphere was permitted to look like when all the specific costs and the specific harms and the specific human beings whose experience of the park was organized around the production of someone else's joy were made invisible in the ways that the institution had specifically invested in making them invisible. The bombs ended the management of the invisibility. The park's post-war history is the specific record of what the space looked like once the management stopped, and the reality of what it had always been became available to be seen without the institutional machinery that had been producing the visibility of the surface and the invisibility of what lay beneath it. What was beneath it is what has always been beneath institutions, organized around the production of surfaces. What was beneath it is what the honest accounting names, and what the naming difficult and specific, and refusing the resolution that would make it more comfortable, is the only available form of respect for the specific people and beings whose experience of the park as the surface was organized to make invisible. Rest now. The park is quiet in the way that places are quiet when the institutional machinery that organized the noise has permanently ceased to function. The rides are still. The mascots stand in their faded costumes in the dark. The Nuka-Cola signs glow or do not glow, according to whatever specific condition of the electrical infrastructure 2 centuries of post-war entropy has produced in each particular location, some glowing with the full, cheerful intensity that the corporation's engineers designed them to maintain indefinitely, some flickering with the specific rhythm of systems in the late stages of their designed lifespan, some dark, in the complete way that things are dark when the last energy available to them has finally been exhausted. The wasteland night holds all of it, with the specific indifference that the wasteland extends to all things equally the surface and what lay beneath it. The joy that was produced here and the cost that its production required, the institution that built this place and the people who bore the weight of what the building required. The fire is warm, the watch continues. Sleep now, wanderer, and let the honest dark hold you as the cheerful dark never quite could, with nothing concealed, with nothing managed, with the full accounting finally available to be carried into whatever rest the night provides.